Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, wonderful news, folks. Today we are going to be talking about a car that I have a wonderful experience with, that I love greatly. I drove a car similar to this for a couple of years. I mean, these are cars that I really appreciate and that I love to learn more about and I love to talk about and I will love to share with you all today. And that is the Cadillac Seville. As you may have remembered in my podcast concerning Cadillac, What Happened was the title of the podcast. I had mentioned the Cadillac Seville, but I decided to go more in depth with the Cadillac Seville, especially on my way to Sarasota the other day. I saw a Cadillac Seville, I think sitting in a parking lot. I think it was for sale or something. And then I saw it. I was like, you know what? I'm going to do my next podcast on the Cadillac Seville. So today we are going to be talking about the Cadillac Seville, which I like to dub as the aspiring European from the Cadillac Motor Company. We are going to be talking about the history, the long and storied history of the Cadillac Seville. We are going to be talking about the Cadillac Seville's mission. What was it sent onto this earth to do, if I could sound all fancy and, I guess, mysterious with that. What is the mission of the Cadillac Seville? And we're going to be talking about some of its contemporaries. What were the cars like that were on the market at this time when the Cadillac Seville came out and when the Cadillac Seville was in its heyday? And we are going to be talking about where is the Cadillac Seville today? What does it survive as? And we are going to be talking about, of course, my personal thoughts on the Cadillac Seville. So why don't we get started? To start off, the Cadillac Seville has a long and storied past. I mean, this is a truly legendary automobile. And I don't just say that because I like them. I don't just say them because they're old and they don't make them anymore. I say this because this is literally one of the reasons why Cadillac is even still relevant today, is because of the Cadillac Seville. If the Cadillac Seville had not come out and Cadillac hadn't revamped its brand image, at least attempted to revamp his brand image, I don't think Cadillac would have survived in the way that it does survive today. If it did survive, it would have been a shell of its former self. I mean, the Cadillac Seville is really what brought Cadillac into the modern era. So let's get started concerning the Cadillac Seville. It was produced from 1975 to 2004 as the Seville, and from 2004 to 2011 as the STS. Now, I know they are technically different models, but because Seville was shortened to Seville Touring Sedan, which is what STS stands for, I consider the STS a Seville because it stands for Seville Touring Sedan. So if we are counting the years of the Seville and the years of the STS in the entire production run, we're looking at a production run from 1975 to 2011, which is a whopping 36 years that Cadillac produced the Seville/STS. This was hailed as Cadillac's first small car. Now, think of it. That was actually a lot bigger of a deal than people may have realized. Because at the time, Cadillac, Lincoln, Chrysler, these large American car companies that made larger than life cars, these boulevard cruisers, for them bigger was always better. I mean, the longer, the better. The wider, the better. The more chrome, the better. The more excess, the better. So when you got a manufacturer making a small car, and not only that, they celebrated the fact that they made a small car. You know, it led some people to kind of scratch their heads like, what, why are you making a small car? Don't you know that bigger is better? And why are you so proud of the fact that you are making a small car? You see, Cadillac was really just keeping up with the shifting times. It was keeping up with the shifting times. So, let's talk about the name Seville. The name Seville actually first appeared to denote the two-door hardtop version of the Eldorado way back in 1956. It was used to denote the hardtop version of the Eldorado from 1956 to 1960, and then that model was dropped. Therefore, the name Seville was dropped, and the model was reintroduced in 1967, a two-door hardtop version of the Eldorado, under a different name. So the name Seville wasn't used again until the Cadillac Seville, which was a standalone model, was introduced in 1975 for the 1976 model year. So the first generation Seville was produced from 1976 to 1979. It was based on a modified version of the X platform that underpinned the Chevy Nova and was named the Cadillac K platform. Now this is different from the Cadillac K platform that my Cadillac DeVille was built on. This is a rear-wheel drive K platform. And actually this is the only generation of the Seville to be rear-wheel drive before the name got switched to STS back in 2004 for the 2005 model year. So essentially from 1980 to 2004, the Seville was a purely front-wheel drive model. Now, I would like to mention that because even though it was made to rival the Europeans, the Seville, the Europeans, and by the Europeans, we're mainly speaking of BMW and Mercedes-Benz here, because at this time, Audi wasn't such a big contender on the world stage, just like Mercedes-Benz and BMW, and Jaguar and Cadillac. I mean, I'm not going to say they never competed against each other, but that's not their goal. They were looking for mainly German rivals here. You know, they didn't make a front-wheel drive car. And the fact that the chief European rival from Cadillac spent most of its life as a front-wheel drive car kind of crippled it. I'm not going to lie. I mean, if you're going to make something to rival the Germans, you should probably make something that is at least reminiscent of what they're making. I mean, at least get the basic formula down. You know, powerful engine up front, rear-wheel drive, good build quality, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this was a front-wheel drive, long, you know, floaty American sedan. No matter how much you could call it Cadillac's small car, it still wasn't small. I mean, the German rivals were still smaller, more efficient, and more nimble than even the smallest American car, which was, you know, like the Cadillac Seville in the luxury car world. So, I mean, you know, it's nice and all that they were able to make it on a platform that was rear-wheel drive at first, but they should have kept it rear-wheel drive. They should not have switched it to front-wheel drive. If they had kept it rear-wheel drive and focused on making it as European-esque as possible, I feel like it would have been a lot more successful than it was. Not to say that it wasn't successful, but it wasn't successful in the same way that they thought it was going to be. And if you stay tuned for the next segment in the podcast, you will find out what I mean by it wasn't as successful as they thought it was going to be. So yeah, the X platform was actually a cheaper platform. Chevy Nova was a cheap economy car. They basically I guess, built the Cadillac Seville on the bones of an economy car. I mean, of course, they renamed the platform because all of the Cadillac platforms had, unique names. It was modified in a different way, but there was still some components there. Granted, the Cadillac Seville didn't use any interior components. It only used structural components from the cheaper economy car that was the Chevy Nova of the day. So it didn't use any interior components. So it's not like, you're sitting on this nice plush velour seat and all of a sudden your turn signal is straight out of a Chevy Nova. No. They managed to disguise it well enough, but it doesn't escape the fact that this was a cost-cutting measure that they just had to do because, they are a large company with lots of fish to fry, and to come out with a car that's going to beat Germany, you're gonna have to cut corners at some point. So they decided to cut corners in this, which I don't find that particularly grievous because, a car manufacturer is gonna do what it's got to do. If they made sure to disguise the fact well enough, and the only reason why, frankly, you would have even known that they built it on the same bones as an economy car was the fact that you had to read about it. Because I can guarantee you, even though I've never sat in a Seville from the era, if it's as good as they say it was, if it's as expensive as they say it was, if it's really meant to beat the Europeans, then you won't even be able to tell if you sat inside of it. So, that's a good thing. So, don't get too hung up on the fact that it was built on a modified X platform. Oh, it's a Cadillac built on an economy car platform. It's no Cimarron we're talking about here. This was a proper Cadillac in its own right. So let's talk about how much smaller was the Seville from the other Cadillac sedans, because Cadillac had always had the DeVille and Cadillac had always had the Fleetwood. Those are probably Cadillac's, at the time, most profitable sedans, the ones that, had been around for the longest amount of time. These were your flagships. These were your things that if you bought a Cadillac, you bought a DeVille, or if you were really fancy, you bought a Fleetwood. So how did it compare as far as size goes? It was 1,000 pounds lighter than the DeVille. Let that soak in. We're talking about the 1976 to 1979 Seville was 1,000 pounds lighter than the DeVille of a similar vintage. That is insane. We're not talking about 300 pounds lighter. We are talking about 1,000 pounds. That's half a car lighter. Granted, the average car weighs around a ton, 2,000 if you're looking for your small cars, 2,000, 2,500 pounds. That is half a car lighter than the other Cadillacs of the same period. And get this, it was also the most expensive. So Cadillac really cast their eggs into this Seville basket here. They had the audacity to peddle a small car and offer the most expensive price that they had on this small car. It's as if though they were making it into an import car. And that, in retrospect, was really smart on Cadillac's part. So it had much better fuel economy, 17 city, 23 highway. That's about as much as my current Buick Park Avenue gets. So I get 17 city, 26 highway. And I get 26 highway on a good day. Usually I'm getting 22 highway. So we're talking about a car from the 70s here, when the DeVille and the Fleetwood were still getting in the single digits. So compared to the other cars, this was actually really small. So 1978 saw the introduction of a diesel engine, the first diesel engine in an American passenger car. It was the first American automobile to provide a full electronic instrument dashboard, so full electronic gauges. First American automobile to do that in, I believe, 1976 or something. Starting in 1980 with the second generation, the Seville became front-wheel drive until 2005 with the STS, as I mentioned earlier. In 1985, these were the bustle back years. These were not very pretty Sevilles, but nonetheless, they existed. I should mention them. From 1985 to 1991 was the third generation. In 1988, the STS trim was added as a sportier option, and as you can tell, the STS trim ended up becoming its own model after a while. From 1991 to 1997, this was the fourth generation. It got the North Star in 93 for the STS, and the SLS got the North Star in 1994. This STS could be optioned up to, we're talking about the fourth generation STS here, could be optioned up to $47,495 in 1990s money. That is nearly $80,000 in 2020. Imagine paying $80,000 for a Cadillac today. Not to say that you can't. You obviously can. But think of the Cadillac that you can get today for $80,000. This is how expensive these cars were. And you will find that later on, I will eat my own words later on in the next segments of this podcast, specifically the last segment. I'm going to eat my own words because I was saying that Cadillac was, a German wannabe. But when I actually look about how expensive the Seville actually was, I mean, maybe not so much a wannabe and maybe so much a hopeful. I mean, maybe not a wannabe, but an actual hopeful actually had aspirations of becoming a German rival. The fifth generation was 1998 to 2004. It was the first Cadillac in modern times to be officially produced in right-hand drive versions for the UK and Japanese car markets. So we're talking about the fifth generation Seville was sold in the UK and in Japan in right-hand drive formats that came like that from the factory. And the STS was a standalone model, Seville's touring sedan, that is, from 2004 to 2011. It was Cadillac's flagship sedan, meaning it was the most expensive, more expensive than the larger DTS. It went back to a rear-wheel drive platform, and it's sold in China as well. So I've slightly gone over time, but I just had to get in that last bit of history. So please stay tuned for the next segment of the podcast in which I'm going to be discussing the Cadillac Seville's mission. What was the Cadillac Seville meant to do? And really, did it actually fulfill its mission? So please stay tuned and enjoy the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, my wonderful car people. Here we are going to be talking about the mission of the Cadillac Seville. We spoke about the history of the Cadillac Seville, the long and storied past of the Cadillac Seville in the first segment. Now we're going to be talking about the mission of the Cadillac Seville. What was it meant to do? Why did Cadillac introduce it, and what were their intentions behind it? So as you've heard me say plenty of times before, look, it's the 70s. There's a gas crisis. I mean, things are looking bad for the automobile companies here in America. American excess in automobiles is being tested, and it's being tested to its very core, to its very philosophy. Let me tell you how. They were forced to downsize, not because the consumer wanted it necessarily, but the consumers were demanding that the cars be smaller because they would be more fuel efficient, and therefore, because gas prices were going up because of the Arab oil embargo, gas prices were going up. Consumers demanded smaller cars that used less fuel, so they would have to pay less money to fill up their cars. So that's why the American car companies were forced to downsize their cars. So that was in 73. Here we are 2 years later in 75. Cadillac is done developing the Seville, which is supposed to be Cadillac's first small car, and it comes out in late 75 for the 1976 model year. So Cadillac acted quickly. Cadillac acted quickly in the sense that they saw a need, they saw a market niche that was opening up for a small American luxury sedan, and by small, I mean relative term, of course. Seville was not small by any measure of the imagination, at least not by today's standards. But they saw a niche that needed to be filled, they sprung into action, and they filled it. So that's basically how the Seville was birthed, if I could put it that way. Plus was the added stress of the approaching German rivals. The Seville was needed, not just because gas prices were going up and it was fuel efficient. And I'm going to say it was actually fuel efficient. We're talking about a 70s car here, getting 17 city and 23 highway. A car, a big American luxury sedan, body on frame. No, well, not body on frame, actually. It was a unibody with a bolt-on subframe, but still, you know, a traditional American luxury sedan from the 1970s getting 17 city, 23 highway. That's something that, oh my gosh, a CT6 today would rival that. I mean, this is great. It was fuel efficient. Not only was it fuel efficient to satisfy the needs of the public for a more fuel efficient car, they wanted something that was going to, you know, be an incentive against buying German cars, if I could put it that way. It's not like the public said, we don't want German cars, we want American cars. The public wanted German cars because they were safer, they were more fuel efficient, they were this, they were that, and then the public needed a car that was, you know, a bit cheaper to combat that. I mean, they didn't realize that they needed it, but they needed a cheaper alternative, and Cadillac was there to offer the cheaper alternative in the form of the Seville. So you had BMW and Mercedes-Benz really gaining a foothold in the American luxury car scene right around the time that the oil embargo is in full swing. It just started a few years earlier. You know, emission standards, gas prices, gas guzzler tax, this, that. I mean, like, while American car companies were floundering and trying to work their way around this and trying to revamp their philosophy to keep up with this, German car companies who had already taken this into account came in and started monopolizing the luxury car market, and Cadillac wasn't going to have any of it. Cadillac, if they were going to go down, wasn't going to go down without a fight, essentially. So they put out the Seville, and, you know, it was like, okay, Germany, well, you think you're so big and tough? Well, here's the Seville. This is an all-American sedan, and we dare you to try to sell this, you know, sell your cars more than we can sell the Seville in our own country. And that's basically, Cadillac put it out there as a crook in the neck of the Germans, because that's what they needed. They needed to have a crook in the neck so they wouldn't come in and just monopolize our car market. Because if the big three, the American car companies, hadn't come up with a result, you know, they would not have gone under per se, but they would have suffered a much bigger hit than they suffered. I mean, they would have need to be bailed out probably. So it was a good thing that Cadillac came out with the Seville at the time that they did. It was smaller and more nimble than the DeVille and the Fleetwood. It was priced competitively against the German rivals. It was cheaper, but not too terribly cheaper. So, you know, when you pricing a car as a car company, you don't want it to be so cheap that the people perceive it as cheaply made or bad quality. You want it to be cheap enough that people see it as affordable, but expensive enough so that people can feel like they're actually getting something substantial. I mean, that's where they kind of played the sweet spot game with the German cars. German cars have always been more expensive, were always going to be more expensive, but they were priced more similarly to the German cars than they were to their American counterparts. So I guess the people who bought them felt like they were actually buying something special because they paid more money for it than a DeVille or Fleetwood, which previously would have been the most expensive models in the Cadillac lineup. The only Cadillac that it wasn't more expensive than was the Fleetwood Series 75 limousine that came straight from the factory as a limousine, which obviously wasn't going to be more expensive than that because you're ordering a freaking limo from your factory. I mean, like, obviously your European rival is not going to be more expensive than that. That's basically, a call to order. They don't make them and put them on the lots. You have to call it and order it, and then they'll make it for you. This is not a car you're gonna get in the 70s. Oh, I got a deal on a Fleetwood 75. I'm getting a lease deal on that. No. Yeah, you bought it because you needed it, and you bought it because you ordered it in. They didn't, make it, put it on the lot, and then you came and bought it. So obviously, it wasn't going to be more expensive than that. It's rather interesting to consider that the Seville was more expensive than all the other Cadillacs, even though the Seville was a mid-size sedan, and the Cadillac mentality was still, for the longest while, was bigger, was better. So yeah, it is very interesting to consider. And like I said, in the last segment, this will make me bite my words. The Seville will make me bite my words because it will no longer be, Cadillac is a German wannabe. Cadillac is a German hopeful, and might actually get there sooner than I had originally thought, because I didn't know how important the Seville was. Here I'm thinking, it was simply to combat, the oil crisis, and, it just happened to be combating the Germans too. No, this was designed to combat the oil crisis and combat the Germans. It was meant to do that. It was marketed as such, and that was the true intention behind the Seville. So the Seville basically ushered Cadillac into the era of chasing after the European luxury cars. The Seville, dare I say, is the first modern Cadillac. And by modern, I don't mean modern in terms of year or technology. I'm talking about in terms of philosophy. It is the first modern Cadillac that left the idea of bigger is better, more chrome equals better, excess equals better. It left that mentality behind. And it took on the mentality of, look, we want a car that handles better. We want a car that's more efficient. We want a car that's luxurious, that handles better, that is this, that is that. It's really started to take into account what the world would think of Cadillac, not just what the Americans would want from Cadillac. That is why I believe that the Cadillac Seville is the first modern Cadillac. It's modern in terms of philosophy. Maybe not in technology, but in philosophy, it should be by and large considered the first modern Cadillac, at least in this age. So it didn't really attract the younger buyers that it wanted to. The Seville was a modest success. And let me explain that. The Seville didn't attract the younger buyers that everybody thought, or at least everybody at Cadillac thought it was going to. Because I highly suspect it had to do with styling. Yeah, they took cues from Rolls Royces. I mean, they had like a good Rolls Royce style grill up front that was a tall radiator grill, especially on the bustle back years. But when you look at it, and when you look at the German cars of the time period, there is a stark difference. The Cadillac still looks like a stuffy American sedan, which no matter how luxurious it was very luxurious, it was very expensive, it had all the latest tech, it had all the latest this, that, gizmos and gadgets and all sorts of other bells and whistles that you could have had at the time period. But it still looked like a fussy old American sedan. I mean, it didn't look like it could compete against the German rivals. It didn't look exciting enough. And if there's anything you should know about young people when it comes to buying cars in the car world, you should know that they're looking for something that's exciting. Not just exciting in terms of what it has, what sorts of bells and whistles it has. They're looking for something that's exciting in performance, looking for something that's exciting in appearance, looking for something that's exciting all the way around. And the Cadillac Seville simply was not exciting all the way around. It was only exciting in the fact that this was the first modern Cadillac in philosophy, and it had all these great underpinnings. But the design, especially the second generation, the design was god-awful. It was hideous. I mean, it looked like a regular full-size sedan from the front, and then it looked like it'd been robbed of its rear end when you turned around back and looked at it. It was this bustle back monstrosity, and it was front-wheel drive and terribly slow. I mean, like, no. You can't pit that against a Mercedes-Benz E-Class of the era. You know, an 80s E-Class. You can't pit that against it. It's more aerodynamic. It's better performing, even though it may not be as powerful. It was a smaller engine with less horsepower, but because it was smaller and lighter, it performed better. I mean, they're night and day. You can't compare the two. So being a young person at the time, you're like, ooh, I want something exciting. I've got a bit of money to spend. Oh, I'm not going to go buy a Cadillac Seville. That's an old people's car. I'm going to buy myself a Mercedes 300D or whatever the E-Class equivalent would have been during that time period. I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to buy this instead because it's faster, it looks better, it's more exciting, it's this, it's that. They're not going to take the time to read all the statistics about the Cadillac Seville and be like, well, the Cadillac Seville was designed with the European rivals in mind, blah, blah, blah. All that's a bunch of jargon to them. They don't care. They want something that is physically more attractive and something that, you know, it's like instant gratification. You buy it and then you automatically feel cool. You know, if they bought a Seville, the Seville might grow on them and they will eventually get to a point where they love it. But it's not something you love off the bat because you're a young person and, you know, your grandpa had a Cadillac. You don't want your grandpa you don't want your grandpa's car. You don't want something that's similar to your grandpa's car even. You want something that's completely different. And I think that's where Cadillac kind of failed to realize. So it was a modest success in the sense that it was popular, people bought it, but it didn't have, you know, the Cadillac revamping that they thought it was going to carry with the first generation. And it didn't, I guess, it didn't take a chunk out of the European car market as much as they wanted it to. So there was that. I mean, you know, the Seville prompted a bunch of copycats. And of the copycats, I would say that the Seville was probably the most successful. Even though it wasn't as successful as they wanted it to, I would say that the Seville was successful in some way, shape, or form. The others, not so much. Now, of course, if you would like to learn more about these copycats, please stay tuned for the next segment in which I'm going to be talking about the contemporaries of the Cadillac Seville, basically fancy term for competitors of the same time period. And I'm going to be telling you their shortcomings compared to the Cadillac Seville. Why the Cadillac Seville was probably the most successful, the most suave, the most genteel, new American sedan of the time period. So please stay tuned for the next segment after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, welcome back, wonderful car lovers. So in the last segment, you heard me talk about the mission of the Cadillac Seville and what it basically meant for Cadillac, what it meant for the American car market, and whether it was successful or not in fulfilling its mission. And you will find that I said it was semi-successful. You know, it sold, it was successful in that sense, but it wasn't successful in revamping the entire image as a whole overnight, and it wasn't, you know, as successful as, you know, drawing a crowd away from German cars to make them buy this. But nonetheless, it is time to move on. So we are going to be talking about the Seville's contemporaries. Let's first talk about the Lincoln Versailles. There's not really much to say about the Lincoln Versailles, frankly. The Lincoln Versailles is basically a copycat of the Cadillac Seville. I mean, the Lincoln Versailles was Ford's response to the Europeans, but was not necessarily as, you know, it was not necessarily as refined. You know, I guess it wasn't as thought out. It's like it was Ford's, you know, a shot in the dark, a shot from their hip, and they're like, okay, we need something. Oh, okay. Yeah, Lincoln Versailles, that's what we're going to do. It was their response to Cadillac Seville. It was their response to the German rivals. There wasn't anything much to it. I mean, that's basically what the Lincoln Versailles was. Chrysler came out with some terrible things. But when does Chrysler not come out with some terrible things? It's just like, you know, I mean, they came out with the LeBaron. Chrysler came out with the LeBaron, and that's where I kind of chuckled a bit. They thought that the LeBaron was going to be an appropriate response to European rivals. So Chrysler came out with the LeBaron. Lincoln came out with the Versailles. Those were the American rivals. Then you had, later on in the game, in like the mid to late 80s, then you had the Japanese car companies, which, you know, sought to take a chunk out of the European car companies as well. You had the Lexus, you had the Acura, and you had the Infiniti. Infiniti had like the QX or something, and then Acura obviously had the Legend. And then Lexus obviously had the LS and the ES. I mean, those were cars that were, you know, made to combat the Europeans as well. Now, here we are. We have these rivals here. We have the American ones. We have the Japanese ones. You will find that they are not as sophisticated. And how exactly do I put sophisticated in car terms? They were not as, oh boy, it's not even the word sophisticated. They're not as finished, they're not as refined as the German product. Because you will find that the American response to the Germans encroaching on the luxury car scene in America was very reactive. They came through, they were like, oh crap, we need something to combat these Germans, and we need something that's not going to be as fuel guzzling as the ones that came before them. So we're just going to, you know, take these economy car platforms, fancy them up a bit, slap a new body on, and call it a day. And you will find that Cadillac in this reactionary phase reacted the best. Because as you can recall from the history portion of this podcast, Cadillac Seville was living on up until 2011, still aimed at the Europeans. Lincoln Versailles only lasted, I think, one generation until the Continental was no longer the full size. It was moved down to the mid-size bracket, and it ended up taking over. But then since then, the Continental became front-wheel drive, and it was a large, floaty, lazy sedan. There was no evidence of sportiness. There was nothing to it. I mean, it was basically, a regular, everyday drab sedan. I mean, that's what, the Lincoln Continental ended up becoming. So hardly even hoping to even combat the Europeans. The Chrysler LeBaron, built on the K platform. So you already know Chrysler at this point, Chrysler never really fully recovered after the oil crisis. I mean, Imperial had to go out because Imperials were too large. They weren't making them anymore, blah, blah, blah. They were facing bankruptcy. Lee Iacocca needed to come in. Lee Iacocca decided to save Chrysler by pioneering the K car, which was basically one platform that they built like 7 cars on top of. And the LeBaron was based on a K car platform. The LeBaron, bless Chrysler's hearts, but that was never going to stand a chance against the Europeans, because you had the SL from Mercedes-Benz that was the European convertible sedan, and then you get the LeBaron. Come on, man. I mean, I'm not going to even warrant it with any further comment. I mean, that's it. Come on. Of course, the LeBaron was later the Chrysler Fifth Avenue, which was a proper sedan, albeit still on the K platform, front wheel drive, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's what it was. So you will find that the American reaction to the German brands was a lot more reactionary. Cadillac probably reacted the best. Then you had the Japanese, who didn't react right away, who sat back, who observed, who saw what needed to happen, and then basically they improved their product in every way possible that the Germans and the Americans had failed in. The Germans had failed by making their cars too complicated to the point where they were not as reliable. Even in those days, German cars were more complicated. So they were so complicated to the point where they were not as reliable. But the Americans, the product wasn't refined enough and was very reactionary, leading to poor build quality, leading to reliability issues because of how it was rushed into production. So the Japanese didn't rush their cars into production. The Japanese took their time to research and see what was accessible, what was permissible, what was available for them to do. And then the Japanese slowly introduced themselves about 10 years later as a new sort of philosophy when it came to luxury and reliability. Instead of luxury and excess, luxury and engineering, it was luxury and reliability that was coming from the Japanese. So once the Japanese moved in, you could really see that the contemporaries of the Cadillac Seville, the American contemporaries weren't successful, and the Japanese contemporaries were much more successful than the Cadillac Seville. Just, going off of that bit of history. And let me take a look at my notes. You will find that Chrysler offered the front-wheel drive platform earlier than Lincoln and Cadillac, and with the LeBaron that later turned into Chrysler Fifth Avenue. So you will find that Chrysler kind of, they were giving up on the rear wheel drive game. They went solely to front wheel drive, and that was their I guess their specialty. Not really specialty. It was just their thing. They were going for front wheel drive cars, so they went for it. And it brings me back to my point. If Cadillac really wanted to be more successful, they shouldn't have offered the Seville in front-wheel drive. This was obviously the days before all-wheel drive was standard on cars, or at least was a standard option on cars that you could even get that. This was before those days. So it's not like they offered a front-wheel drive variant and then they failed to offer an all-wheel drive variant. That wasn't a thing. They should have just offered it in rear-wheel drive and called it a day. It would have been more... Not only would it have performed better, it would have been more like the Europeans. So they made the mistake of staying front-wheel drive and never switching back to rear-wheel drive until much later on in the game. I will say all the manufacturers were like grade school kids that waited till the last possible second to work on their project, and these cars were the result of their procrastination. I mean, that was when that thought dawned upon me when I was writing out, the outline for this podcast. I was like, I'm definitely going to read that word for word. Just imagine you're in elementary school, and then the teacher is giving you a project to work on for the past 2 weeks over like spring break or something. And then it's a Sunday night before school starts on Monday. You've known about this, but you wanted to have your fun. You wanted to stay to what you were used to doing over the weekends, over the breaks. That it's when time is finally running out. And then you are pressed to do this. That's when you're like, okay, we're going to scramble together and we're going to throw this project together. Well, if I were to grade the car companies on their projects, I will say that Cadillac got an A-. Cadillac didn't get an A+. Cadillac didn't even get an A because they did not keep the Seville rear-wheel drive and they made it too American. It needed to be more European. Yes, it was fancy. Yes, it offered all these, features and other sorts of things, fully digital dash, blah, blah, blah. People didn't care. People wanted rear-wheel drive. People wanted performance that was similar to the Europeans. And the way to achieve that was if you had painted it, or not painted it, made it rear-wheel drive. So Cadillac received A-. Lincoln received a B-. Lincoln kind of half-heartedly did it. I mean, they were there. They had a car. Car wasn't that great, but at least they had one. So B-, they tried. They had the effort, but there was a lot of things that were missing that they could have added. Chrysler, I would say, probably got a C+. Not too far away from Lincoln. What really killed Chrysler was the fact that they just had only one platform to work with. And really, at that point, you couldn't really blame them. It wasn't much of their fault. They just got dealt a bad hand. Financial troubles hit the company. They needed to cut costs. And the fact that they still were able to at least offer a car that was able to be, even if it was just a hopeful German rival that was able to even combat the Germans, was incredible in itself. So Chrysler gets a C+ for their effort, at least. And, it's really interesting to look at the different sorts of approaches when it comes to the European encroachment on the luxury car market. What did GM do with Cadillac? What did Ford do with Lincoln? And what did Chrysler do with, Chrysler? I mean, it's very interesting to see how that ended up happening. So please stay tuned for the last segment in which I'm going to be discussing where is the Cadillac STS today? What does it live on as? And what are my thoughts? Because I'm sure you all are dying to know what my thoughts are. So please stay tuned for the next segment, and we will be right back after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, welcome back, car lovers. This is one of my favorite times because I get to talk and say whatever I want. But anyway, so we talked in this podcast so far about the history of the Cadillac Seville. We talked about the mission of the Cadillac Seville. What was it there for? Why was it created? What did it do? And we talked about the contemporaries of the Cadillac Seville, specifically the American contemporaries. But we made tribute and gave credit where credit was due to the Japanese ones as well. But let's talk about, where's the Cadillac STS today? Or at least where the Cadillac Seville is today. I should have labeled this segment. So, the Cadillac Seville was produced from 1976 to 2011, and I'm including the last 7 years from 2004 to 2011 as still under the Seville because it was changed to the STS, which stood for Seville Touring Sedan. So it is still a Seville in my book. So after the Seville Touring Sedan, the STS was discontinued. The line was merged, the DTS and the STS becoming the XTS, and the CTS was moved up the line to the midsize, and then the ATS was introduced to take over the segment that the CTS used to be in, and that's what the lineup was for 5, 6, 7 years. It was ATS, CTS, and XTS. XTS was the full-size sedan that was still front-wheel drive that ended up replacing the DTS and the STS. But as far as the real successor to the STS, it would have been the CTS. At least, I believe, third generation of the CTS was there to replace where the Seville used to be, where the STS used to be. It was the new midsize sedan, and it was just recently replaced within the past 2-3 years by the Cadillac CT5. So really, the Seville lives on today as the CT5, at least as far as Cadillac's midsize offering goes. If we're talking about flagship, as far as I am educated, as far as I know, the CT5 is no longer the flagship sedan for Cadillac. It is now back to the full size. That is the CT6. That is the full size sedan for Cadillac. That is the flagship sedan for Cadillac. So by flagship, I mean this is the one that's going to be the most expensive, the one that's going to get the best treatment, the one that's going to get the most technology, the one that's really going to be the brand putting its best foot forward. It's no longer the mid-size like it was for so many years that I wasn't even aware of. So here is what my thoughts are. I am surprised. I actually did not realize how significant the Cadillac Seville was to Cadillac's modern day philosophy as a whole. I mean, Cadillac, far be it from them to say that they are still the standard of the world. Cadillac is no longer the standard of the world. But Cadillac is more of a world player than I thought because of the Seville. We're talking about a car that not only was hailed as the first small car here in America. Yes, Cadillac's first small car, I should say. We're talking about a car that was, in today's money, at some point could be optioned up to $80,000. That's S-Class territory money. I mean, granted, an S-Class, if you're going to get a base model, you're probably looking at around $90,000 for a base model, but still, that is S-Class territory money. You are nipping at the heels of the Mercedes-Benz S-Class when you're offering a fully loaded Cadillac STS from the 90s as being $80,000 in today's money. That is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, that's insane. So not only were they becoming a world player, they actually had the car to back it up. They had the specs to back it up. We're talking about the specifications of these cars. The STS had 300 horsepower, albeit it was to the front wheels, which did it a disservice. But we're talking about, some pretty sick vehicles out there. And not only that, the Seville it ushered Cadillac in to the era in which it finally started taking a hard look at the German rivals and was like, look, we got to do something about this. We got to do something about this. And just like I had said during the Cadillac episode, and like I said during the traditional American sedan episode, I mean, just like I have said several times, Cadillac really went all in when it came to trying to defeat the German rivals. And you know, now that I see how good the Cadillac Seville and how good the Cadillac STS that came after the Seville were when it came to combating, you know, the German rivals, it begins to make complete sense now why the Cadillac Seville was the way that it was. Think of it this way. You have Cadillac having two sedans. You have the one that is put on the pedestal. This is the flagship. This is the one that has the technology. This is the one that you want. This is the one that's the most expensive. That's the one that they pitched against the Germans. And then you have the DTS, which is your still floaty American land yacht sedan that is pitched at the American market, pitched towards the older people, pitched to, get the Lincoln Town Car out of the way and to make Lincoln nervous because now they no longer have like a traditional luxury sedan after the Town Car went away. So like that's what they were doing. Their efforts nonetheless were split, but their efforts were split not because they couldn't make up their mind like I had previously said. Their efforts were split because that's how their efforts had to be. They couldn't leave the Germans behind, but they couldn't leave Americans behind either because Buick was still, during the 2000s was still competing against Mercury. So it's not like they can move Buick up the line. So they had to use Cadillac to, combat Germany on one front and then combat the American rivals on another front. So that's why they had the Seville as the flagship brand, because the Seville was supposed to be the Cadillac that you thought of once you thought of Cadillac. The STS was supposed to be the same way. So it all makes sense now. My mind is slightly blown because I'm like, oh, that makes sense. I mean, now I understand why Cadillac has been chasing the Germans, because they actually had a car to chase the Germans with. They had the STS. We're talking about a car that had, oh my gosh, rain sensing wipers in the 90s, a fully digital dashboard display by the late 70s. I mean, it was $80,000 if you got a fully, option loaded up version. In today's money would have been $80,000. I mean, these are all things that the Germans, as far as I'm concerned, the Germans didn't have a fully digital dashboard, still don't. And they didn't have 300 horsepower in their cars in the 90s. They didn't have, all this stuff that Cadillac was putting in their car. And which it brings me to think about just my own personal thoughts. What would it have been like if the STS and the Seville, I'm just going to use them, interchangeably, the Seville specifically in this case, though, what it would have been like if the Seville had always been rear-wheel drive. Would the Seville have been an E-Class killer? You know what? Maybe it would have. I believe that the Seville was that good. I believe the Seville was that good that it may have been an E-Class killer if they had given it the chance to be rear-wheel drive and to actually prove itself. Cadillac just never gave the Seville that chance. They kind of kept the Seville, even though it wasn't as floaty, even though it wasn't as luxurious as, or at least luxurious feeling as the other, cars in Cadillac's lineup, but they never gave the Seville the attention that it needed until it was too late to really combat against the German rivals. If they had built up a long legacy of combating German rivals, then the STS would have just been that much better because it's already building off of the long legacy it had before. The STS basically had nothing to go off of. because it became a completely different car. It was rear-wheel drive. They finally listened and put a rear-wheel drive platform on it. They had an STSV model. I mean, this was the car that you wanted to rival the Germans. But the Seville before it, however, was not given a fair chance. With all of the technology that it had, with all of the innovation that it had, it should have been given a fair chance to combat the German rivals. And I believe it would have actually done well. I mean, I'm just thinking back. One of my favorite cars of all time is a 1995 Cadillac Seville STS. I want one so badly. And there was a customer at Hallmark where I used to work that had one. And I remember I was standing there with, I think, Nancy Fry way back in the day. And then we were standing and I saw that car in the parking lot. I was like, oh my gosh, I love that car. And then the people came into the store. I was like, look, I love your car. They were going to sell it to me. Too bad I was a broke, college student at the time. I couldn't spend like the $1,500 that they would have wanted for it. I mean, like, if I had known now what I knew, or if I had known then what I know now, I probably would have saved up the money, gotten a loan, done something to buy the car. But I mean, it's already long gone now. But in retrospect, this is a car that I would want way more than an E-Class of the era. This was a cool car. Yeah, it was front-wheel drive, but this was a cool car. Now, imagine if that car had been rear-wheel drive. It came with a manual option, something to really, stick it to the Germans and be like, yeah, well, you can be cool, but we can be cooler, and this is a Cadillac from America, and we're going to show you who's boss. If they really had done something like that, I mean, I'm just, I'm bouncing in my seat. I'm like, Cadillac would have been really good. Cadillac would have really stuck it to the Germans then. They really would have done it, but they never did. They never did. So whereas I believe that the Seville is a great vehicle and the STS is a great vehicle, this was what I was talking about. Not to say that Cadillacs aren't luxurious. It's just Cadillac hasn't been able to live up to the German brands yet. It still hasn't been able to. Evidenced by the car that they were going to do it, even though it graduates from wannabe to hopeful, where it could have been. The reality was it didn't. They had the car, they had the formula down, but they didn't execute it the way that they should have. What really would have saved the Seville, in my opinion, is if they made it rear-wheel drive, they stuck it with the rear-wheel drive, and made it almost like a Grand Tourer. Of course, it wouldn't be a Grand Tourer because it doesn't have two doors, but almost like a Grand Tourer, where it was fundamentally different from the other cars in the lineup, solely built for the purpose of defeating the German rivals, or at least taking a chunk out of their market. It was too American. Front-wheel drive, sort of floaty suspension, even though the STS had a stiffer suspension. It was still too American to really make a difference against the German cars. The German cars still remain different enough that if you wanted a German car, you couldn't rationalize getting a Cadillac Seville and saying, well, it's just as good as a German car, because for what they were looking for what people who buy German cars are looking for, they were looking for much different than the Cadillac was willing to provide. So that's basically where the cookie crumbled. I mean, you heard the history of the Cadillac Seville. You heard the mission of the Cadillac Seville. You heard about its contemporaries. You heard about what it's doing today, how, its grandchildren live on as the Cadillac CT5 and whatnot. And you heard about my personal thoughts about the history and what really could have done. So I thank you very much for listening to this episode of the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, David Lucy Mabel, and please, if you like us, please subscribe, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, share it with your friends, and thank you so much, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.